So let us quickly take a look at our course setup, and specifically let's take a look at this ngtemplate component, which you're going to use throughout the entire series of this course. So we are going to extend this and make it more dynamic, more feature-rich. So right now what you see is whenever we give this component inside a template, we get this as a result. So we have different kind of tabs inside here, which is done by this ngx tab. And as you can see in the first one, we have a people list, so another component which gets displayed, while in the second tab we simply have some static content, and that works as well. The title is given by this tab title property here, and as you can see it gets then displayed on the tab headers. Now if we jump into that ngx tab here, it is quite simple actually. We have some styling here around it, and the template is nothing else than a div inside with a class pane which adds some styling. And then we have basically an ngcontent section which allows us to project content from the outside, which is in this case the list or the static content as we have seen. Moreover, there's a hidden property which simply reacts here on this active property which gets input from the outside, so it gets controlled by someone else. Now to jump back, if we now take a look at the entire tab, which is the ngx tabs, which groups all of these together, let's jump into that tab component here. Now here what you can see first of all is that we use below here a so-called add content children of our tab component, so of our single tabs, to query basically all of the tabs that have been added here in this content projection section here. So whenever our component has been initialized, in the ng after content init section, we can query basically this content list, and so we would get all of these single tabs that have been added inside. Once we have those in this list, we use them here to create the header section above. So you can see here the UL and LI, which is then styled accordingly, obviously with some kind of classes. And that makes up then the whole header section up there. Further down, we have then some additional logic, like here we basically select the first tab, so that whenever we initialize everything, the first one automatically gets the focus. And similarly, in the select tab, we basically deactivate all other tabs, and then we activate the first one. So that it also works whenever we switch the tab, that tab gets focused while the others lose their focus. So if you want to have some kind of dynamic templates, which we can then grab from our code and pass around to other components, we first of all need to find a way of how to define them within our components template. That's exactly where the ngtemplate tag comes into place. And this is a special tag which we can define within our template of another component. And we can also write here something inside. When we then save this, you can immediately see that the template actually doesn't get displayed on our UI, because this is just something we can define inside here and then grab later and use it somewhere else, for instance. Now, of course, in order to be able to grab this template, we need to have a way to access it from our code. And the first step here is to define a so-called template variable. So let's call this person edit, for instance. And then we can go back into our component code and we can use an annotation which is called viewChild. And inside there we reference the person edit, which we just defined. Now the viewChild is something we need to import from Angular core as well. So this is viewChild. And then next, for being able to access that viewChild, we need to also use a specific lifecycle hook of our component, which is the after view init. And so we need to import that as well after view init here, and then implement our interface accordingly. And as a result, further down here, we can now implement the ng after view init lifecycle hook. And inside here, we can simply try and log out the reference to our person edit template. And now once the application refreshes, you can see we get a so-called template ref inside here, which has a couple of properties, which you can now go and explore further. So as you can see here, what we have done is we have defined an ngtemplate, which is a template which can live within another template. And as you can see, it doesn't get rendered actually. We assigned here a template variable, which is person edit, and we accessed it via that viewChild, and then further down in the according lifecycle hook here of our component, namely in the after view init, we simply log it out. And in fact, if we open up the DevTools console, you can see here our template ref being logged out. Now this is not really exciting. What we really want to arrive at is to take this one and pass it ahead to another component, which then uses it. So imagine we want to extend our ngx tab here, that it doesn't render the static content which we provide here via the content projection mechanism, but rather we want it to render our template which we pass in. So let's take this out for a second here, jump into our tab component, which is responsible for rendering this part here. And of course, as a first step, we need to add here an input, which will be our template, which gets then passed from the outside by whoever is using us. Great. Next, we need obviously to adapt our template here, such that whenever our template property here is being passed in from the outside, we want to render that template, and otherwise we want to use that ngcontent projection section. As such, the first step can be here to use an ngIf and add here a not template. So whenever it's not present, it will get hidden. Otherwise, it is being shown. Now for rendering an external template, we need a new tag, which is the so-called ngcontainer. And the container allows us to basically use its property, which is called ngtemplateoutlet, and assign it to a template which gets passed in as a reference from the outside. So as you can see here in the console log, which we have printed out before, this is a so-called instance of a template ref, and that's something we can then pass on to that ngtemplateoutlet of this ngcontainer, and then it's being rendered. Obviously, we also need to adjust here the logic a bit, like let's say it only renders whenever the ngtemplate is actually defined. So now our ngx tab component is ready to accept such a template from the outside. Now we need to go back to our app component, and we actually need to reference it. That's quite easy. So we can simply use our new template input property, which we have defined, and then we use that person edit variable here and pass it in. Once our browser refreshes, we can then jump in here, open tab 2, and you can see here we get the content which we have actually defined in our ngtemplate below here. So here we have defined a reusable template within our app root component here by using the ngtemplate. We have assigned it a person edit template variable such that we can then reference it and pass it ahead to that ngx tab component. Inside that ngx tab component, we then took in that template via that input here, and we rendered it out by using the ngcontainer and specifically leveraging here that ngtemplateoutlet property of that container. Now, while this works perfectly, like as you can see, the content gets rendered properly, we would really like to bring this a bit further in that we can pass in some data from the outside and render that data dynamically. And I want to have my template as independent as possible, so I'm not going to, for instance, directly reference that people here, but I rather want that the component which is rendering that template passes in the data itself. So to achieve that, let's jump to our tab component again. And first of all, we will get past our data from the outside. So again, we need an input here, and let's call this data context or something like that. Now to pass on this data onto our template, we have another property, which is called ngtemplateoutletcontext. And here we can then pass on our data context. Now, usually use an object here, such that you can then extend it later on if you have different kind of data which you want to pass into our template. So in our case, let's call it simply data, and we reference our data context. Great, so now our tab component is ready. Let's jump back to our app component again. And now inside here, we can now leverage that data context which we have passed in. So first of all, we obviously need to pass it along. So we use here the data context. And in our specific situation here, I'm referencing the first person of that people array, which we have in our component here further down. Now that data gets passed in, and then inside the ngx tab component will pass it along to our template, which in this case resides here. So now we can leverage that data object which we passed in and use it inside our component here. So assume we want to have something like that. So I want to say here, hi, and then I want to pass in the person, so the person gets passed into our template, and I want to visualize that person's name. So I would do something like person.name. I use here the null coalition syntax because the person could obviously be undefined. Now, as you can see, the compiler complains here because that person doesn't exist. It's not a variable which is known by this template here. Now we can define this variable simply by using here the let minus and then the name, which is in this case person. But obviously we have to give it also a value here, and which in this case will be data. Now it's important to know that this data is actually the one which we have named inside here. So whenever we pass on the data here, we gave it an object structure with a name. So the key here is data, and that's exactly the same one which we can then reference here and assign it to our local person variable. And now once the browser refreshes, if we jump back to the tab 2, you can see now that the name gets properly visualized. So right now we have our ngx tabs component, which renders different kind of tabs which are defined here statically. And so they are basically via the content projection mechanism ported into our tabs component here and rendered out below here. Now, what we would like to achieve is obviously to go into a more dynamic direction where we can define here different kind of templates inside here and then dynamically inject such ngx tab components which use our templates. Now, first step for doing so is to give here another region, which we have already seen by using an ngtemplate. And this will be the region where we want to inject our dynamic components later on. But first of all, we need to have a way for referencing this ngtemplate. And furthermore, we need to get access to a so-called view container ref, which will then allow us to create components dynamically. So let's go step by step. Let's use the Angular CLI and generate a new directive, which will serve us as an anchor point. Now let's jump to our dynamic tab anchor directive. And this is a plain normal directive. We actually only use it for the view container ref. So let's first of all import the view container ref. And we can then inject it directly here. We can then use this directive later on to basically access this view container, which is here a public member of this directive. We can now go back to our tabs component, and as a first step, we obviously need to import our dynamic tab anchor directive here. And then we can go to our ngtemplate and actually apply it. So we use here the app dynamic tab anchor, and inside our tab components code, we can use the view child and grab all instances of such dynamic tab anchor directives. And let's call it dynamic tab placeholder. And it's obviously the instance of such a dynamic tab anchor directive. Once we have that, we can now create here an open tab method, which will then be called from the outside. And for now, let's simply log out the view container ref of our dynamic tab anchor directives. Great, so finally, let's also call that open tab method from our app component here. And as you can see here, I am using an app people list, which already renders such a button. So we can simply hook onto that event here of the add person and call it on add person. We obviously also have to implement that in our component here. And what we do here is to simply call our tabs component and the open tab function which we just created. The tabs component, as you can see, is already here being grabbed via a view child again. And now if we save and open up here the DevTools, and if I click add new person, we can see that the view container ref gets properly printed out. So in our example, we have created such a dynamic tab anchor directive, which we have then applied to our template for later accessing the view container. Now this is one approach. Another approach would be to define here a template variable and again accessing it via a view child instruction here. But by also adding here an option where we say read only the view container ref. And that would be an alternative approach of how to define an anchor inside a template. So in our example here, we have most of the building blocks which help us to build actually dynamic components. So first of all, here we have a way for defining our template. We then reference the template and pass it along, in this case, directly via some input property to our tab. That said, also the tab component itself, so the single tab here is ready for being created dynamically because we have already defined here some input properties which allow us to pass in the template and the data. And then inside there in the template of our tab component, we actually can use then the ng container and the template outlet for referencing the template and the template outlet context for passing in the actual data which we get from the outside. Also in our tabs component, so the whole component which groups all of the single tabs in itself is ready. So what we have done there is we have an ngtemplate where we have attached some dynamic tab anchor. And that's an anchor directive which we reference here and which allows us then to later get access to the so-called view container ref, which we will need for then attaching our dynamic components onto it. Great, so let's get started with actually instantiating our component dynamically. So first of all, we need to get access to the component factory resolver. And we get that injected here in the constructor. Then further down, we can remove that log file here and start actually using that component factory. And here we basically create a new factory out of our component, which in this case is basically our tab component, because that's the one which we want to create dynamically. Once we have that, we can get access to that view container ref by using our anchor, because we will then need that view container ref to actually create a so-called component ref. So we use that view container ref dot create component, and we pass in our component factory, of course. And at this point, we basically have here a component ref instance. And now to get the actual instance of our tab component, we can do something like component ref dot instance. And now here we have actually the living instance of our tab component in memory. Now, as you have seen, the tab component has various properties. So if we do instance dot, we see here we have to associate the title, the template, and data context. So these are the things which we obviously want to pass from the outside. So let's add here some parameters. This is string. Then we have the template and some data. And so now we can associate them and say like tab title equals to title. Instance dot template is equal to template. Great. So now we have wired them up. Let's then create some local array for keeping track of our dynamic components. This is useful for later than interacting with a single dynamic component. What we also would like to have is that whenever our tab gets instantiated here and added to our view, it should also get the focus. So we can directly use that select tab function, and let's simply pass in the dynamic tab here, which we have just created. Cool, so we also need to do some housekeeping here. So what you see here is in the select tab, we have basically our tabs array, which here in our static part gets directly injected here via the content projection, and we grab it via that content children. Now we have a second array here, which is the dynamic tabs. And so what we have to do first of all is we have to generate here the header sections also for our dynamic tabs. So I simply copy and paste this in here. And here we use the dynamic tabs. Obviously you could merge those two so you can avoid some code duplication here, but for the purpose of this example, let's just clone it here. And similarly, we also need to do here the same thing when we select a tab. So we don't just have to iterate over the tabs, but also the dynamic tabs, and to deactivate them accordingly. Great, so now we should actually be able to use it and invoke that open tab function from our app component. So let's jump there and start implementing it here. As you can see, the first one here is the title. So let's simply input here dynamic tab. Then we can use the template. And if you remember, template has already been defined here by using this view child, and here by referencing this ngtemplate in our template section of this app component. So let's simply use that one. And as a last step, there is the data which we have to pass in, and here we can simply use our people array and access the first person. Now, once the browser refreshes, if we click now add new person, you can see that the tab opens dynamically. And you can also see here, hi, I'm Yuri. So here we have a pretty complete implementation of such a dynamic tab component. As you can see here, we have the tabs. We have the single tab here, which is a static one. And then we have below defined a template, which whenever we click some action, for instance, that add new person, we dynamically instantiate new such tabs, and we pass along that template which we have defined here. So for instance, if you take a look here and that list, basically which renders this part here as well as the button, we have different kind of events which we hook on into our component. And then inside there, we simply invoke the open tab method on our tabs component, which then basically takes some parameters, which is the title, which should be displayed on top here. It also takes along the template and eventual data that gets passed on. For instance, in the added person, we pass on the person that is being edited. And in that case, internal then the tab component takes care in that open tab to dynamically instantiate the tab component to reference all the data and then basically to select the tab. So as a result, you can see how that gets instantiated dynamically here. Now, what we would like to focus in this lesson is actually to provide some further functionality such that to cancel such tabs or to close it again, for instance, whenever we click that save button or via an icon which we can display up here. And during that phase, we need to also take care to properly destroy those dynamic components here in order to avoid memory leaks. So let's see how we can implement such scenarios. So first of all, let's go into the tab component and let's add another input property here, which is called isClosable, which is false initially. So this will mark whether our tab can actually be closed or whether it's a permanent tab. Next, we need to go into our tabs component, and we want to adjust our header section here such that we can render some kind of icon or something the user can click on to close the tab again. So for that purpose, I go directly into the dynamic part here and say spun. And we obviously want to display this only when the tab is actually closable. And whenever the user clicks on that, we want to invoke some function which is called close tab, and we pass along the tab as well. Now obviously we need to create this function. Let's jump below here and enter here this close tab. We get here a tab component as the parameter. Now given the tab instance here, we need to also find the corresponding match in our array in order to remove it from there. So let's simply iterate over the dynamic tabs array and fetch it out. So whenever these references match, we know that we found our tab. So what we can do, first of all, we can remove it. So let's use here splice. Now we have removed the tab from our array such that it doesn't remain inside there. As a next step, we then need to make sure we destroy our component. And for that purpose, we again need to get a reference to our container ref. And then the view container ref has a convenient method on it, which is remove. And then you can provide it an index where you want to remove basically the dynamic component. Now, since we iterate over our array and we know that we have added our component on that array at the same time when we have added it to that view container ref, we can rely on the same index number. So we can simply pass in I. And then as a final step, just to make it look a bit prettier, let's select basically the first tab again. And now given that we have found our tab, we can simply break out of this loop here to optimize a bit the performance. Now, what we have missed here is to actually also assign the isClosable property onto our tabs so that it can be passed from outside. So we said isClosable to isClosable. And this is a parameter which we need to add here on top. And we can even make it like an optional parameter, so in that case the user doesn't have to specify it always. So now let's jump back to our app component, and then we can say like on the added person we want it to be closable, so you can always abort that action, as well as on the editing of a new person we want to be that closable again. So with that, whenever now I click on the add person, I can click here the X again and it closes, and similarly also for the editing here. What's probably missing is that whenever we click here save, we would also like to have our tabs being closed. And so we could do that by simply going here to the on person submit, and at the very end we say this.tabscomponent.close tab. Now since we're not sure which tab is currently open, we could add something like close active tab, which is something we have to create, and we go into our tabs component at the very end and we add here the close active tab function, and that function would simply grab the active tab, which we can do by using the dynamic tabs dot filter, and we verify all the tabs whether that tab is active. Whenever we have found such tab, we simply invoke the close tab function, which we already have here from those tabs which we have found. So from the first one which I have found. And now if we edit the person, for instance, and I write here not Yuri but Thomas and say save, you can see that it's being edited. You can also add new people. And obviously since this is a tab component, we can add new people, we can edit people at the same time. So we can change it here and change it here as well. So as you can see now, we have a fully functional tab component where we have just some hard-coded tabs, which is the first one, and then we have some dynamic tabs which open up based on the user interaction.